The island of England lay still, tucked beneath clouds that moved like ghosts above the grey sea. The waves were soft that season, brushing against the pebbled shores without urgency. Fields lay golden and damp from mist, dotted with sheep and low stone fences. In the south, thatched villages nestled into hills, smoke curling up into the sky like questions never answered. The people lived quietly, bound to the land and the rhythm of the church bell. In the great halls, lords dined beneath wooden beams, their firelight throwing shadows onto embroidered tapestries. And though the old king still lived, his presence felt far away, like a sun hidden behind clouds. It was the year 1064, and yet it felt like time was pausing, just long enough for the breath before something shifted. These were the final calm hours before history changed its course. And perhaps, deep in the stillness, something ancient understood this. That peace, while warm and steady, never stays. Not in kingdoms, not in hearts. Dear listener, we truly care for you. We hope tonight brings you comfort. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. Across the channel, in the lands that would one day be called Normandy, the nights were colder and filled with thoughts. Duke William of Normandy, tall, hardened by years of rule and carrying his lineage like a weight on his shoulders, often walked the corridors of his stone keep in Rouen alone. His lands were rich, his soldiers loyal, but his eyes often turned west, toward the sea. He had not forgotten a promise, nor had he forgiven those who broke it. The Normans had Viking blood, though the years had softened their sails into banners and swords, into symbols of law. Still, something restless moved within them. Normandy was not a quiet land. Monks copied texts in candlelit rooms while blacksmiths beat iron to the sound of hooves in the distance. The Duke's court, full of men with thin smiles and sharp minds, spoke often of England, of opportunity, of claims, of fate. But outside the court, the people ploughed and prayed and waited. In dreams, some said they saw the ocean open. Others spoke of crowns floating on water. Dreams, perhaps. But in this age, dreams were sometimes warnings. Or maybe they were invitations. Back in England, an old king began to drift. Edward the Confessor was growing more spirit than man. His voice had softened, and his gaze often lingered not on people, but on the past. He had no son, no clear heir. His court, anxious beneath layers of respect, grew louder when he left the room. Among them stood Harold Godwinson, tall, proud, with a fierce clarity in his step. Harold had proven himself in battle and council alike. He was not of royal blood, but his family's roots reached deep into English soil. One journey, long remembered, would place him in the heart of Normandy, where a complex thread of vows would be spun, oaths given under pressure, perhaps misunderstood, perhaps never meant. But in these lands, oaths were not things to be undone. They clung to the tongue like iron. Edward, soft-spoken and devout, had once hinted that William, his distant cousin, might succeed him. Perhaps he meant it. Perhaps he did not. But once the words had left his lips, they were no longer his. In politics, a whisper can become a weapon, and a memory, if wielded carefully, becomes a right. The kingdom waited, holding its breath. Around the hearths in winter, farmers whispered of omens. A comet, they said, or lights in the sky that danced and vanished. In the north, the earls stirred, some loyal to Harold, some only to themselves. The land was not united in spirit, even if it looked whole on a map. The Welsh border still ached from recent campaigns. The Scots watched warily from beyond the highlands, and across the sea, in the cold halls of Norway, another king, Harold Hardrada, listened to the wind and remembered old glories. But in England, people dreamed more of harvest than war. Children ran through mud-thick streets. Mothers stirred porridge in low morning light. Priests lit candles before pale stone altars, and still the king lived. Though he grew quieter each season, his crown still cast a shadow. It was a shadow both Harold and William walked within, one in flesh, the other in thought. Yet no one truly knew what would happen when the crown passed. All they knew was that it would, and that nothing, once passed, could return to the way it was. Edward the Confessor's health continued to falter as the year turned. His skin grew pale, his voice thinner, and the weight of his silence heavier. The court of Westminster stood hushed, draped in gold and incense. But beneath the beauty, there was unease. The old king no longer rode out. His meals grew small. The fire in his hall warmed only the air. Those close to him began to watch one another, not with kindness, but calculation. Edward, saintly to some, elusive to others, had built his world on stillness and prayer. But politics never rested, even when a king did. And without an heir of his own blood, every gesture became loaded, every word measured. Some believed Harold Godwinson would ascend, others looked beyond the sea. The court divided without saying so, and the old man, whose dreams had always felt more holy than earthly, may not have realized just how many futures rested on his final breath. They say that oaths made under pressure can still echo like truth. In the year before Edward's death, Harold had journeyed across the sea, shipwrecked, captured, and brought before William, Duke of Normandy. What passed between them remains debated, but the heart of it was simple. Harold swore to support William's claim to the English crown. Perhaps he did it to secure his own release. Perhaps he believed Edward had already named William as successor. Perhaps it was all ceremony. But William believed the promise sacred. The Duke, shaped by years of war and distrust, saw words as stone. When Harold later took the crown for himself, William saw not politics, but betrayal. A Norman knight's honour was forged in blood and faith. An oath was a line in time, and breaking it was not just insult, it was cause for war. Back in England, Harold moved quickly after Edward's death. He was crowned with speed, no great pause, no debate. The people accepted him. But across the Channel, the tide of resentment had already begun to rise. William had always lived as if the world owed him proof. Born the illegitimate son of Robert the Magnificent, he was never meant to rule. But he had carved out his place with sword and mind alike. By the time Edward died, William had ruled Normandy for decades. He was feared, respected, and never forgotten. And now he claimed he had been promised the English throne. To him, it was not ambition. It was justice. So he began to speak with the Pope. He gathered ships. He called on lords. Messages crossed Europe, carried by messengers on thin, tired horses. William framed his cause as righteous, a rightful duke claiming what had been denied. His wife, Matilda, moved through the court with quiet grace, encouraging the cause in her own way. Priests gave blessings. Blacksmiths lit fires that burned day and night. In Normandy's forests, men practiced with bows and blades, waiting for word. They called it a cause, but to many, it already felt like a reckoning. On the shores of England, Harold moved to secure his reign. He strengthened ties with noble families, visited sacred places, and promised stability. But England had never been easy to hold. The north was distant in spirit, the Welsh border fragile, and far beyond, Norway stirred. Harold Hardrada, the warrior king, believed he too had claim, an ancient agreement, long buried, now whispered through the sagas. 3 men, 1 crown, and yet, for a moment longer, the land remained quiet. No battles yet, just glances, just messengers, just silence thickening in the air. In churches, candles flickered before painted saints. In taverns, talk grew sharper, darker. Somewhere, an old man carved a symbol into wood, not knowing why. Somewhere, a child asked what war meant, and no one could answer. Not truly. The wind shifted. The sky, once grey, darkened to storm. Across the water, sails were prepared, not yet raised. In England, the harvest came late. Rain fell on old stone walls. Roads turned to mud, the kind of weather that seeps into bone and makes one wait for something. And though nothing had yet begun, everyone could feel it. The pause before the blow, the breath before the shout. In halls across the kingdom, people began to gather maps, mark supplies, speak in shorter sentences. Harold's crown weighed heavy, though he wore it proudly. William's rage stayed quiet, but it grew sharp. The world seemed balanced on the edge of something sharp and invisible. And still, the people worked their fields. Still, the monks sang their hymns. Still, in some village, an old woman watched the horizon and wondered why the birds had flown early this year. The crown sat upon Harold's head like a question with no answer. On the day of his coronation, the bells of Westminster rang, though the sound did not carry joy. The room was full, yet something about it felt unfinished. Edward had died without a word against Harold. The nobles had accepted him. The archbishop had blessed him. And still, in the hush of the cathedral, as smoke from incense drifted through the arches, it felt more like a storm approaching than a new beginning. The people in the streets cheered, but in their eyes was worry, not celebration. They had seen kings come and go. They knew that silence did not mean safety. Far across the sea, others had heard of Harold's coronation. And they did not bless it. They sharpened blades instead. In Normandy, news arrived like a dagger. William's court fell into stillness when the word came. Harold had taken the crown. The oath meant nothing. The promise had been broken. William's hands closed slowly, not in panic, but in resolve. He did not shout. He did not weep. He summoned his council. He wrote letters. He sought the Pope. If war would come, it would come not as a raid, but as a divine answer to injustice. He framed it not as ambition, but as restoration. William's gaze was not soft, and those who stood with him felt the heat of his fury beneath his calm. He called upon his vassals and offered them land, titles, and glory. Mercenaries began to arrive, ships were drawn up in harbours, trees fell by the hundreds to feed the hunger of the fleet. Smiths forged armour without pause, and yet it all unfolded slowly, like a tide preparing to return. In the quiet hills of Sussex, life carried on with a wary rhythm. Harold knew the wind was changing. He had messengers watching the coastlines and eyes on the northern border. Rumours flew faster than birds. Some said William had already sailed. Others said he was dead. The truth, like always, lived somewhere in the middle. Harold strengthened his defences and kept his army close. He knew William. He knew the way he moved. Cautious but inevitable. The English fyrd, made of free men summoned to fight, trained in open fields and narrow lanes. They had fought before, they would fight again. But this time felt different. This time the fight would not be for land or borders. It would be for the future itself. Yet still, the trees kept blooming. Still, the rivers flowed. The sky remained wide and cloudless, as if refusing to warn them. The summer lingered, and with it, a strange stillness. William's fleet, though ready, did not sail. The wind did not favour him, and so he waited. On the coast of Normandy, thousands of men gathered, fed and prayed, while their leader studied the tides like a priest reads scripture. Across the water, Harold remained on edge, his men tired from waiting. The weight of uncertainty wore through leather and bone alike. But just as attention turned south, the danger arrived from the north instead. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, sailed down the English coast with a fleet full of iron and fire. He had not forgotten the old agreements, nor had he forgiven the fading of Viking influence in England. At his side was Tostig, Harold's own brother once exiled, now returned with vengeance in his heart. It was betrayal in its oldest form, and it arrived on black ships beneath a sky that had forgotten how to sleep. In the chapels of Rome, William's envoys knelt beneath high ceilings in candlelight, pleading not just for support, but for righteousness. They laid out maps, letters, testimonies, all evidence of the oath Harold had broken. The Pope listened. His advisors whispered. The politics of the church were not swift, but they were always moving. And so, at last, a banner was given, not just cloth, but authority. It carried the weight of God's favour, or so it was said. With this blessing, William's cause was no longer his alone. It became sacred, and sacred causes need not whisper. They march. When word returned to Normandy, the wind did not change, but the air did. It became sharper, more certain. William raised the banner before his men. He did not shout. He did not roar. He simply held it, and they understood. This was not theft. This was correction. The harbours swelled with ships. The forests had fed them. The rivers carried their bones downstream. Men from across France, Brittany, and Flanders arrived to pledge their swords. They came not only for faith, but for reward. William promised them lands in England, not coins, soil, titles, and that was power few could resist. Under creaking rafters, they signed names and sealed pacts. Armour was fitted, horses trained, and yet the sea held firm. The wind would not allow the crossing. So they waited, days upon days, watching the horizon. It was not time yet. Across the water, Harold fought in the north, a brutal, thundering clash at Stamford Bridge. The Viking king, Hardrada, fell there, as did Tostig. And though Harold won, it cost him dearly. His army was weary. His breath came shorter. But news of William's landing would not wait. Not even for the wounded. When the winds finally turned, it was as if the world itself gave permission. The Normans boarded ships carved with eyes and symbols, pulled by oars and prayer. They sailed not with song, but with silence. Some wept softly, others whispered to saints. It was not a large fleet, but it was certain. On the 28th of September, they touched the shores of Pevensey, Sussex. English earth met Norman boot. The invasion had begun. Yet there was no clash, no storm, no screaming sky. Just the low sound of waves behind them and a future rising ahead. They built a wooden castle near the shore, fast and efficient. They gathered supplies. They did not rush. William had waited too long for this. He would not stumble now. Harold, still in the north, received the news like a breath stolen from his chest. He turned south at once, gathering what remained of his army. There would be no time to rest, no pause to pray. He marched with urgency, knowing what lay ahead. The roads turned hard, the fields narrowed, but his resolve did not waver. As he moved, messages spread through the land. The Normans had come, and with them came a new kind of war. Not raiders, but rulers. Not looters, but law. William did not burn villages without cause. He sent envoys. He offered peace to those who would kneel. But his sword waited behind his words. And in the churches of England, priests read from Latin texts with shaking hands, unsure whose name to speak in their prayers. The old order had been cracked open. Something new was stepping through. And it wore steel. The early autumn air was thick with tension, as if the land itself held its breath. Far north, the battle lines were drawn where the cold winds swept over Yorkshire's rugged hills. Harold Hardrada, the fierce king of Norway, had come to test the fate of England. With Tostig, once an exile and now a shadow of vengeance, he brought not only soldiers, but a storm of old claims and restless ghosts. The clash at Stamford Bridge was brutal, the ground soaked with the memory of thousands of footsteps and steel. Harold Godwinson, weary but unbroken, met them with the ferocity of a lion protecting its den. The battle tore through the dawn, the sound of clashing swords mingling with cries that echoed like thunder. Harold fell, pierced by an arrow, his ambition silenced beneath the grey sky. Tostig died alongside him, swallowed by the chaos he had summoned. Victory was Harold's, but it came at a price. His men were battered, his strength sapped. The war that had been long whispered about was now a fire roaring to life. No sooner had Harold turned from the north than word reached him of another threat. William and his men had landed on English soil. The Normans arrived not as marauders, but as conquerors bearing the weight of destiny. At Pevensey, they stepped from their ships onto a land they claimed by oath and blood. It was not a moment marked by chaos or clamour, but by the steady rise of an inevitable tide. They built a fortress with quiet urgency, timber and earth shaped by skilled hands. The Normans did not seek immediate battle, their power was patience and preparation. Harold marched south with all speed, his army weary from the recent fight, but fueled by a deep and fierce resolve. The roads felt longer, the skies heavier, and the fields watched silently as history moved across them. The air thrummed with the promise of confrontation. The fate of England rested not on grand speeches or fleeting alliances, but on the quiet strength of men standing firm. The countryside itself seemed to listen. Trees stood still against the wind. Rivers flowed slow and steady, as if marking time. Villages paused in uncertain expectation. Mothers clutched their children close. Fathers looked to the horizon, their faces worn and unreadable. The world held its breath. This was no longer a distant story told by travellers or monks in candlelit abbeys. It was immediate. It was near. It was the slow, relentless beating of war's heart. Each man in Harold's army carried not only sword and shield, but the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. Every step was a question. Every pause a silent prayer. They came to the hill where the two armies would meet, a place that would be remembered forever, though names would fade and stories twist. Hastings was not just a battlefield. It was a crossroads of futures, a place where the past and the future collided in steel and silence. In the days before the battle, the tension was like a thin thread stretched tight. Men prepared quietly, sharpening blades and tending wounds. They whispered of home and harvest, of wives and children, of sunlit fields left behind. The night was cold and dark, with only stars to witness the thoughts that lingered in the soldiers' hearts. Harold walked among his men, his face calm, but his eyes carrying the weight of a king who knew what was to come. He did not speak of victory or defeat. He spoke only of duty, of honor, of the land that held them all. And as dawn broke, pale and grey, the armies faced each other across the fields. The ground beneath their feet was the same earth that had held generations before. But on this day, it would soak with more than rain. It would soak with the quiet cost of power and the echoes of broken promises. The morning sky was heavy with a grey light that softened the edges of the world, as if the earth itself hesitated before the coming storm. Harold's army stood assembled, a sea of shields and armour that glinted faintly beneath the mist. The men were weary, their bodies marked by recent battles and long marches, but their resolve was steady. Each carried a quiet weight, the knowledge that what lay ahead was not just a fight for land, but for the soul of a kingdom. The fields around Hastings stretched wide and open, the gentle slopes promising little hint of the violence they would soon witness. Birds fell silent, and even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. Harold moved among his men with measured steps, offering nods and brief words to those who met his gaze. There was no boastfulness here, only a shared understanding of sacrifice. The horizon blurred with the soft light of dawn, and time itself seemed to slow. William's forces waited across the field, a disciplined mass of knights and archers. The Normans had come prepared, their armour polished, their horses restless but trained. They wore the weight of expectation with a quiet dignity, and their leader stood tall, calm as ever, watching the English ranks with eyes that missed nothing. The morning was still, the silence heavy like a promise of what was to come. The two armies faced each other, separated by a stretch of land that would soon echo with the clash of steel and the cries of men. Yet before the battle began, there was a moment fragile and fleeting, where both sides seemed to hold the same breath. It was a breath filled with memories of home, of loved ones left behind, of futures hanging in balance. No words were spoken. Only the soft rustle of armor and the steady rhythm of hearts beating beneath chainmail. When the first arrows flew, they were like whispers carried on the wind, gentle but inevitable. The sky darkened with their flight, and the earth trembled with the feet of charging horses. The battle erupted slowly, a dance of strategy and endurance. The English shield wall stood firm, a solid line of wood and iron that absorbed the onslaught. Their spears bristled like the quills of a great beast, each man holding tight to his place. William's knights pressed forward, weaving through the arrows and striking with precision. The sun passed through the clouds, casting shifting shadows over the field where fate was being forged. The noise grew, a swell of voices, the clang of swords, the thud of bodies meeting earth. Yet amid the chaos, there was also a strange rhythm, a pulse that seemed almost alive. This was the heart of war, beating in steady time with the hopes and fears of those who fought. Hours passed, marked only by the changing light and the toll of battle. The shield wall held, but cracks began to appear. Some English warriors fell, their bodies swallowed by the earth. Others stood firm, driven by loyalty and the weight of their oaths. William, watching from a ridge, directed his forces with quiet command. He knew the battle was not won by strength alone, but by patience and cunning. And so, tactics shifted like shadows. At moments, the Normans feigned retreat, drawing the English forward into traps laid carefully beneath the grass. Each maneuver was a question, each response a gamble. The field became a place where courage met calculation, where the tide of war turned slowly but surely. Men fought not only for themselves, but for the silent promises of a kingdom uncertain of its own future. As the sun dipped low, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of battle softened to a murmur. The shield wall, once unbroken, was shattered piece by piece. Harold himself fought with fierce determination, his presence a beacon for his men. But even kings are mortal, and the day carried its own cruel reckoning. An arrow, guided by fate or chance, found its mark in Harold's eye. The king fell, and with him, the spirit of the English army began to waver. Some fought on, others fled, and the field grew quiet under the weight of loss. The Normans moved forward cautiously, their victory heavy and complex. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. In the shadows that followed, the land mourned quietly, as if remembering the cost of power in the silence after the storm. After the battle ended, there was no celebration, only silence, the kind that lingers like smoke, the kind that makes even birds forget to sing. The field at Hastings was no longer a place of purpose, but a grave. The dead lay quiet beneath a grey sky, their armour still, their hands open to nothing. The English crown had fallen along with its king, and with it, something deeper, an order, a rhythm, a way of life. William remained cautious in the days that followed. He did not rush forward. He did not declare himself. He let the silence settle. His men tended wounds, gathered supplies, and buried the fallen. The wind blew gently through the trees, brushing against the torn banners and broken spears. It was not victory that filled the air, but waiting, watching, a kind of reverence, a kind of fear. William knew the battle had not won him a kingdom, only a doorway. The path beyond was uncertain. England was not a land easily tamed. Its people, though scattered, still carried pride. In the north, power remained in the hands of earls who had not bent the knee. In London, the city held its breath, unsure whether to resist or surrender. William moved with care. His army was not large enough to crush rebellion outright. So he paused in the south, building fortifications, reaching out with letters instead of swords. He offered terms. He sent envoys. He waited, knowing that fear, hunger, and exhaustion could do what steel sometimes could not. The silence between battles became a weapon of its own, slow, invisible, but deeply felt. And all the while, the people watched from behind shuttered windows, wondering who would hold power next, and what that would mean for the shape of their days. Harold's body had been lost in the chaos, but his memory lingered. In hushed whispers around hearths, some said he had not died at all, that he had fled, wounded but alive, waiting in the wild places. Others claimed to have seen his ghost, walking among the fallen. Truth no longer mattered. What mattered was the feeling left behind, that something old had broken, and no one knew yet what would rise in its place. Monks in their cloisters copied the news slowly, their hands trembling above the parchment. Children listened to stories that now ended differently. In villages, old women crossed themselves when strangers passed. It was not just fear of Normans. It was fear of change and of not knowing what to believe. Even the land seemed quieter. The rivers ran slower. The trees shed their leaves early. Autumn deepened, and with it came a stillness too heavy to carry. William began to move again, carefully like someone entering a dark room. He sent a message to London, offering peace if they would accept him. The city hesitated. Inside its walls, nobles argued. Some wanted resistance. Others saw futility. The crown had no head. The army had no heart. And the people wanted only rest. In time, their silence became consent. As William marched slowly toward the city, his army passing through villages like shadows, he found less resistance than he feared. Some swore loyalty, others stood aside. A few cursed him, but quietly. Winter was approaching, and with it came cold that no fire could drive away. On the long road to London, William passed through a country half awake, its people dazed by loss and change. He did not burn as he went. He did not conquer with flame. He simply walked forward, step by measured step, as if the crown were already his, and time itself had chosen him. Winter crept in quietly, without ceremony. The roads to London turned to mud beneath the boots of Norman soldiers, and the countryside folded into grey. Trees stood bare like bones, and the last light of the year fell cold on stone. William and his army reached the outskirts of the city without great resistance, but the city itself was uncertain. Inside London, there were voices still unwilling to yield. Nobles of old blood, bishops hesitant to accept a foreign king. They spoke of Edgar Etheling, the boy with royal lineage who had been briefly considered. But England was tired. Its heart had bled too much, too quickly. Harold was dead. The field was broken. No army remained to challenge the advance. And so, in quiet halls and private rooms, the final decisions were made not with swords, but with sighs. At Berkhamsted, the surviving leaders came to William. There were no speeches, no pageantry, only lowered heads and solemn hands offering what remained. It was not surrender in the old sense. It was something slower, the kind of acceptance that grows from exhaustion. William did not gloat. He did not raise his voice in triumph. He simply received their pledges and walked forward. On Christmas Day, in the great church at Westminster, he was crowned King of England. The stone walls echoed with chants in Latin, the incense heavy, the ceremony thick with meaning. But beneath the robes and crowns, there was unease. As William took his oath, those around him grew nervous. A murmur rose among the guards outside the church. They thought it was a rebellion. Flames licked briefly at nearby buildings. Set in panic, swords were drawn. Outside, confusion reigned. Inside, William stood still, the crown placed on his head even as chaos flickered at the edges. It was a strange coronation, not a celebration, more a moment of realization. William, Duke of Normandy, was now king, but the crown sat heavy, not in weight, but in memory. The kingdom had been won, but not yet healed. To hold what he had taken, William built. not with words, but with stone and timber. Across the land, castles began to rise, square, solid, grim shapes that did not belong to the English landscape. Towers stood like watchful eyes above rivers, forests, and crossroads. These were not just homes for nobles, they were symbols of presence, of permanence, of power. The English had known war before, but they had not known this. The slow reshaping of their world by foreign hands. Norman law began to take root. Norman lords received English lands. The language of court changed. Latin filled the records. French filled the halls. The old English tongue remained, but only in corners, behind closed doors, in songs sung softly to children. The transformation was not immediate. It was quiet, like frost settling on a window pane, but it reached everything. Not all were willing to accept it. In the West and North, resentment stirred. Old loyalties refused to fade. Rebellions flared like sudden fires. Some rose with hope, others out of desperation. But William answered each with precision. He built roads where resistance gathered. He placed his men not just as warriors, but as watchers. Oaths were demanded, and when broken, punished. The English nobles who remained had to choose daily between survival and pride. Some bent the knee to preserve their lands. Others vanished into woods or fled to monasteries. A few plotted in silence, waiting for a moment that never came. The kingdom was no longer theirs, but they had not yet learned how to live without it. In this New England, loyalty was a language rewritten, and betrayal came not just from swords, but from silence, from hesitation, from choosing not to speak when one was expected to. The snow melted slowly that year, leaving behind a land heavy with mud and memory. Roads once beaten by armies were now travelled by tacksmen, priests, and Norman stewards wrapped in fine cloaks. England had changed, but not all at once. The fields still grew grain. The rivers still moved in their old directions. The sun still rose above the same hedgerows where children played and mothers hung linen to dry. But beneath that quiet, something deeper had shifted. It lived in the way villages fell silent when strangers passed. In the way names once spoken with pride were now remembered only in whispers. The new rulers built their keeps high and strong, but their power rested on ground that did not yet welcome them. William held the crown, but the land itself had not finished deciding whether it would allow him peace. The North, proud and distant, had always been different. Its loyalties were deep-rooted, and its resentment older than even William knew. In 1069, that resentment turned to fire. An uprising began in York, joined by Danish forces who arrived across the sea like echoes from an older time. The rebellion was fierce but brief. William's answer was brutal and cold. What followed was known later as the Harrying of the North. Villages were burned to ash, livestock slaughtered, fields salted, survivors scattered. The winter that followed was not merely cold, it was hollow. In the charred remnants of once living towns, children froze beside the ruins of their homes. Priests prayed over empty altars. The land fell into a silence deeper than before. It was not just a punishment, it was a warning. To resist was not only dangerous, it was unsustainable. William did not want to be feared, but if fear brought silence, he would accept it. Still, resistance did not vanish. It retreated. Into forests, into prayer, into stories passed quietly from elder to child. Some joined monasteries not from devotion, but to escape. Some left for foreign shores, hoping to find a world untouched by conquest. But most stayed. They tilled the same earth. They tended the same sheep. They learned to survive beneath a rule they had not chosen. Over time, the edges of pain dulled. A new generation rose, born not in the Old Kingdom, but in the Norman one. Their speech carried both accents. Their prayers named both saints. And slowly, as years passed, the memory of resistance turned into legend. The names of fallen lords were carved not into new laws, but into the carvings above doorways and in the margins of family Bibles. The tide of conquest had not erased England, but it had changed its rhythm. William himself changed, though not outwardly. He remained sharp, disciplined, rarely seen without armor, but those close to him noticed the weight he carried. He had won the kingdom he claimed was his by right, and yet it had come at a cost. His court grew crowded with men hungry for land, favour, and recognition. Balancing their demands while keeping the English subdued became a burden without end. He built more castles. He appointed more bishops. He kept his children close, especially his sons. But there was no rest. Power once seized must be constantly guarded. And the weight of ruling a foreign land was not just physical. It was spiritual. The land beneath him was ancient, with its own stories and silence. And though William sat atop it, it never quite felt like his. Not fully. He was king, yes, but also something else. A guest, a guardian, a shadow. The years moved on like mist across a field. Soft, slow, and difficult to trace. What had once been fire became ember. What had once been rebellion became silence. But it was not peace, not truly. It was something else. A waiting. A watching. A long and quiet erosion of the world that had been. The English people did not rise again in great numbers. They did not gather in secret armies or send messages across seas. Instead, they adjusted. Not out of weakness, but from where? The old lords had fallen. The old language was fading from the halls of power. The rhythms of life had changed, not in one great collapse, but in 1,000 small defeats that reshaped the soul of the island. The new administration took root with care. William replaced English abbots with Norman ones, each chosen not just for piety but for loyalty. Churches were rebuilt in the Norman style with thick walls and rounded arches. Towers rose where none had stood before, not only to praise God but to mark dominion. The monasteries filled with scribes who copied not just scripture but laws, new ones, in new tongues. Across the countryside, people began to hear different words from the mouths of priests and lords. Even the name of the land was spoken, differently now. What was once home now sounded foreign in the mouths of those who ruled it. But no one shouted. No one wept aloud. They carried on, planting seed, gathering wool, teaching their children the stories they could still remember. Some changes came without malice. A Norman knight might marry the daughter of an English noble, bringing uneasy peace to old enemies. Children of such unions grew up speaking both tongues, neither wholly one thing nor the other. They became bridges, sometimes willingly, sometimes unknowingly. In kitchens and courtyards, accents mingled, words blended, traditions softened. A new culture began to rise, not by decree, but by necessity. But even as new roots formed, the people remembered the old names, not in rebellion, in reverence. The memory of Harold did not fade. In some homes, his likeness was carved quietly into wood, behind hearths or beneath roof beams. He was not worshipped. He was remembered, a symbol of what had been lost, and in that remembrance lived both sorrow and strength. William ruled with an iron will, but even iron wears thin. His attention was pulled constantly, between England and Normandy, between rebellious barons and restless sons. He trusted few. He travelled often. His sleep grew light. He grew heavier in body, more silent in speech. Those closest to him knew that the crown had aged him, not in years, but in weight. He had crossed the sea to claim a throne, but found instead a labyrinth. Every promise made to a loyal follower was a promise denied to another. Every new law risked alienating the past. He could not rest. Not truly. Power was not a seat. It was a posture, and he held it always, even in solitude, even in dreams. He had not come to England as a stranger. He had come as a king. But the land, ancient and deep, had made him a stranger all the same. The years passed, and the weight of rule settled deeper into William's bones. He had crossed the sea as a conqueror, stood crowned in the halls of kings, and broken rebellion with fire. But time did not fear him. It wrapped around him slowly, pressing against the joints, softening the voice, and pulling shadows longer than light. He still travelled, still held court, still enforced his law, but those close to him saw it. The way his eyes lingered longer on silence. The way he touched the hilt of his sword not out of readiness, but memory. His kingdom stretched wide, but so too did its cracks. Old rivals had fallen away. Yet now it was his own sons who looked upon his crown with restless hearts. The challenge no longer came from without. It was within. In the blood he had passed on. In the ambitions he had raised. His eldest son, Robert, known to many as Curthose, carried both pride and resentment. Normandy, the land of William's origin, had been promised to him, but promises, like oaths, are rarely clean. William held power tightly, and Robert wanted it now. Father and son quarrelled more often than they spoke. There were rumours of rebellion. Not wild, but simmering. Robert had friends in high places. And William, though still king, could no longer see through every shadow. The court grew divided, not along lines of language or nation, but of blood and bitterness. In the north, threats lingered still. Scotland's king edged closer to the border, and whispers of unrest flickered like candlelight. William rode north once more, not in fury, but with resolve. He built more castles. He left garrisons. He reminded the land of his presence. Yet each journey felt longer. Each campaign ended not with celebration, but silence. In the great halls of England, the stone felt colder than before. Fires were lit. Food was served. But the warmth did not last. The Norman nobles, now settled and wealthy, turned more toward managing estates than defending crowns. They had won what they came for. Now they wished only to keep it. England's people, once so restless beneath foreign rule, had grown quieter. Their sons had grown up speaking both French and English. Their daughters married men with foreign names. The old bloodlines had not vanished, but they had thinned, blurred, folded into new patterns. The old songs still lived, but they were sung differently now. Slower, with refrains that had softened under time. What William had conquered, he had changed. But in changing it, he had also changed himself. His rule had begun with clarity. It ended in the soft muddle of compromise, exhaustion, and unspoken regret. In 1085, facing rumours of foreign invasion and unrest, William ordered a survey of his entire realm. He wished to know what he truly held, not just castles and towns, but fields, oxen, mills, tenants, everything. The result was a book unlike any other, a record so vast and detailed that even the smallest village felt its weight. It came to be known as the Domesday Book, final, absolute, without appeal. But beneath its pages was not triumph. It was worry. It was a man looking over a kingdom and asking quietly what it had cost. 2 years later, while leading a campaign in Normandy, William was thrown from his horse and injured. He lingered for weeks in pain, breath growing shallower, memory slower. He spoke little in those final days. Some say he asked for forgiveness. Others say he said nothing at all. The crown was passed. The land moved on. But for a time, in a room filled with flickering candlelight, the man who had crossed the sea sat alone with the weight of his name, and no banners could carry that. The crown, heavy beyond measure, passed from father to son with little ceremony and much uncertainty. William's death left a silence in its wake, a quiet space where once roared a kingdom. His eldest, Robert Curthose, inherited Normandy but chose neither to return quickly nor to rule with the firm hand his father had wielded. England, meanwhile, passed to William Rufus, a son more restless than resolute, who claimed the throne with ambition but lacked the quiet strength, needed to hold all that had been gained. The fragile unity that William had forged began to fray like old cloth. Across the lands, the weight of conquest settled into cracks and fractures that grew with time. The early years of William Rufus's reign were marked not by peace, but by disputes. Between brothers, between nobles, between the crown and the church. The land had been stitched together with power and fear, but the stitches began to pull loose. Robert demanded more from his brother. The barons pressed for privileges lost or forgotten. The church raised its voice for authority and lands. In towns and villages, taxes grew heavier. The memory of peace was a distant dream, one replaced by whispers of rebellion and unrest. William Rufus ruled with a temper sharpened by battle and ambition, yet his grasp was uneven. The throne was his, but the kingdom was not quiet. Shadows lengthened, alliances shifted like sand beneath tired feet. In Normandy, Robert's indecision weighed on the land. He was a ruler less inclined to command and more to hesitate, caught between the legacy of his father and the realities of a restless duchy. His barons grew bold, their loyalty fragile. The promises made to William's men, lands, titles, security, were now debts owed and grudges held. Robert's campaigns were half-hearted, his focus pulled by his own desires and fears. His brother's reign in England complicated matters, as brothers quarrelled over borders and influence. The sons of William were men of fire, but the fire burned unevenly, flickering and sputtering beneath the layers of duty and disappointment. In England, the memory of conquest became a backdrop to daily life, rather than its centre. The castles William had built stood firm, but watched over uneasy peace. The Norman nobles had settled into their estates, their power secure, but their ambitions limited by the crown's instability. The English people adapted, their tongues weaving old words with new, their customs blending with those of their rulers. Yet beneath this surface lay a current of quiet resistance, small acts of defiance and the preservation of identity. The land had changed hands, but not hearts. In monasteries, scribes recorded both history and hope, their ink tracing the slow passage of time. The wounds of war healed unevenly, leaving scars beneath the calm. The struggle for power between Robert and William Rufus culminated in moments of confrontation, but never full conflict. Their rivalry was a battle of wills more than armies. The Crown of England and the Duchy of Normandy were torn between them, each pulling in different directions. Neither could hold all that William had claimed. Meanwhile, across the seas, other forces moved. Scotland watched the unsettled kingdom with keen eyes. France saw opportunity in distraction. The fragile balance of power shifted again, with no easy path back to unity. The legacy of the Norman Conquest was not a throne secured, but a kingdom in tension, held together by memory and the quiet, slow pull of consequence. Time is both healer and thief. It moves without pause, carrying with it the stories of those who came before and quietly erasing the edges of their lives. The Norman Conquest, though forged in fire and steel, lived on not only in castles and laws, but in memory. Memory carried in the hearts of those who survived, and those born afterward. The price of memory was not counted in gold or blood alone, but in silence, in stories left untold, in traditions folded quietly away. As years passed, the people of England navigated a world reshaped by conquest, where old identities tangled with new, where languages met and sometimes clashed, and where the past lingered like a shadow beneath the light of the present. In villages scattered across the land, the songs of old warriors still rose at night, sung softly by grandmothers to restless children. The tales of Harold and his shield wall, of the battle at Hastings, were passed down not as history, but as echoes of a lost world. These stories carried sorrow and pride intertwined, a bittersweet reminder of what had been and what had been taken. They were whispered beneath breath, often when strangers were near, as if the very act of remembrance was an act of resistance. Yet with each telling, the stories changed, softened, sharpened, reshaped by the hands of memory. What once was clear and immediate became legend, sometimes distorted, sometimes preserved in fragments like broken glass catching light. The land itself seemed to hold these memories, in the silent fields, in the ancient trees, in the stones beneath the feet. The great Norman castles, towering and formidable, stood as both monuments and reminders. Reminders that power could be built and held, but also that it could be challenged and changed. Within their walls, new lords ruled, their tongues foreign, but their ambitions familiar. They sought to govern not with fear alone, but with law and order, to weave themselves into the fabric of a land that was at once strange and familiar. The English, for their part, learned to live alongside these new rulers. Some embraced the change, finding in it new opportunities, new voices. Others held tight to the old ways, keeping their customs alive in hidden corners, in secret gatherings, in the quiet refusal to forget. The tension between memory and adaptation was a slow dance, delicate and fraught with unseen fractures. The church played a quiet but powerful role in shaping memory. Monasteries and cathedrals became centers not only of worship, but of record and reflection. Monks copied manuscripts, chronicling the past with careful hands. They preserved documents, kept genealogies, and wrote histories that sometimes favored the conquerors and sometimes mourned the fallen. The Latin of their texts spoke across centuries, binding together worlds of kings and peasants, battles and prayers. Through the church, memory became a living thing, shaping identity and belief. But it was also a place of silence, where voices were lost. Women, the poor, those who bore the true costs of war in ways that were never recorded. Their stories lived in absence, in the spaces between lines, in the quiet corners of stone cloisters. The descendants of both Norman and English blood learned over generations to share a land that was neither fully one nor the other. The New England was a tapestry woven from threads of conquest and resilience, of loss and hope. Languages blended, laws merged, and cultures intersected. The name of the land changed hands, but not the earth beneath it. Fields still yielded harvests, rivers still ran clear. The memory of the conquest was both a burden and a gift, a reminder of what had been broken and what could still be rebuilt. It was carried not only in history books, but in the hearts of those who walked the soil, who loved the land, who dreamed quietly beneath the stars. In the end, the price of memory was the willingness to remember without bitterness, to carry the past lightly enough to move forward, but firmly enough never to forget. The years settled like dust over the land shaped by sword and oath. The castles that once rose as symbols of conquest became part of the landscape, weathered by time and softened by moss. The kingdoms that had clashed so fiercely found new rhythms, new ways to exist beside one another. The people who had borne the burdens of war and change continued their lives in fields and villages, in towns that grew slowly beneath watchful towers. What remained after the fire was not just stone and story, but a deep, quiet pulse, a heartbeat carried in the earth, in the rivers, in the wind that moved through hedgerows and open fields. It was a pulse of endurance, of memory, of hope tempered by loss. The Norman Conquest, with all its violence and ambition, left a legacy woven into the very fabric of England. Laws were rewritten, languages mingled, and cultures blended in a slow, steady unfolding. The changes came not as sudden storms, but as seasons, each bringing its own shaping force. The land that had been torn by war began to heal, though the scars remained beneath the surface. The voices of those who had lived through the upheaval grew faint with each passing generation, but their stories echoed still. In the names of towns, in the stones of castles, in the quiet pride of those who called this land home. The conquest had altered the course of history, but it had also revealed the resilience of a people who could survive and adapt, who could remember and rebuild. In the centuries that followed, England continued to grow and change, shaped by the legacies of its past. The Normans became English. The English absorbed the Normans. Borders shifted, kings rose and fell, but beneath it all was a land that held its stories close. The ancient forests whispered of battles long ended. The rolling hills held the footsteps of countless generations, and the rivers carried secrets from the past into the future. What remained after the fire was a tapestry of memory, complex, layered, and alive. It was a reminder that history is not just what is recorded, but what is lived. Not just what is won or lost, but what endures in the hearts of those who follow. As night falls over this land, as stars begin their quiet watch, we remember not only the kings and battles, but the countless lives touched by the shifting tides of power. The children who slept beneath thatched roofs, the farmers who tilled the soil, the monks who prayed in stone cloisters, all carried the weight of change with grace and quiet strength. Their stories may never fill the pages of great tomes, but they live in the breath of the wind and the rustle of the leaves. The Norman Conquest is not just a chapter in history, it is a whisper that carries on, a reminder that after every fire, there is a world waiting to be born anew. And in that world, the past and future meet, softly, like shadows blending into the dawn. The end